A great man named Teddy Roosevelt once said, "I believe in rough games and in rough manly sports." He said this while being harped on about the game that we know as football. The game of football is a big deal to me, and the game is a character builder for the youth who participate in it. We'll be discussing the long line of history that football has been through and the effects it has on participants. It's a great game that can influence the youth. Today we will talk about the first time it was played, how Teddy Roosevelt influenced and saved the game, and the way it is today compared to how it was a century ago. Some may ask themselves, how long ago did football begin? Football started in the year 1869 when Rutgers played Princeton in what is known today as the first ever collegiate football game. Today the game is 100% different, and when it began it was a rugby-style game. As a matter of fact, an article from dailyhistory.org stated, football traditions resembled a cross between rugby and mob football. These games initially had few clear rules, except masses of students who would play together and two sides would compete to possess the ball and try to score. The game had very few rules and very minor equipment, which in turn was more dangerous. An article written by Christopher Klein had much to say about the dangers of the game, lacking rules. With little protective equipment, players sustained gruesome injuries, wrenched spinal cords, crushed skulls, and broken ribs that pierced the heart. Today's game makes lots of money, and in the beginning, they made little to none in comparison. The game was different. There was far less sales in tickets and merchandise, and the amount they made compared to the league today was nothing. According to an article from ProFootballHallOfFame.com, most star players in 1892 made $500 per game. President Teddy Roosevelt was the President of the United States who had great love for the game of football. In an article written by Christopher Klein, it said that Teddy Roosevelt's son played for Harvard during the almost tragic loss of the sport. Teddy Roosevelt also had the opportunity to play for Harvard when he went to school there, but he had to turn it down due to his farsightedness. The game was brutal. No equipment and no rules equaled major injuries. The Chicago Tribune reported that in 1904, there were 18 football deaths and 159 serious injuries in one season alone. Klein also said in 1905, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton were called to the White House to discuss excessive violence and set fair play for the rest of the country. This had a big turnaround. It solved lots of issues, not all of them, but it dialed down on the injuries and dangers of the game. Klein also wrote in 1906, another football meeting was adjourned and helped the sport. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Today's game wouldn't be the same way it is today without Teddy Roosevelt and his love for it. Football is 100% different nowadays than it was in the 19th century. It's one of the most popular sports in the world, and it has a lot more income due to ticket sales and merchandise, and a heck of a lot more rules. NFL.com gives a copy of today's rule book and equipment rules where there are 244 pages as opposed to maybe 5 or 6 rules in the beginning. The first time it was played, there were no rules, no equipment, no money. And nowadays, there's unreal amounts of money. According to the Washington Post, the highest paid player in the NFL is Aaron Rodgers, who is said to make a whopping $176 million in the next 6 years without his endorsement deals. Today, we have talked about the beginning of the sport, the great save by Teddy Roosevelt, and the difference in today's game compared to a century ago. After all the history of the game of football, I hope that you have learned some things you didn't know. And a great man once said, "I believe in rough games and in rough manly sports." He was referencing the game of football, the toughest sport